Hello. I've been wanting to make some YouTube videos and have been encouraged to do so by others. And this will not be any kind of regular thing, but it will be um, when the mood strikes me. Uh, One of the things that has irked me and continues to irk me is a lot of the misinformation on YouTube. Um, Pseudo-scientific knowledge that is not really based on real study, but it just somebody makes a YouTube video based on some other YouTube video they watched. Um, One thing that is particularly egregious with this phenomenon is when people talk about quantum physics, and in particular the measurement problem. Um, so the measurement problem is if there's a probability of, Schrodinger's cat being alive or dead, you open up the box and it's either alive or dead. But the idea is that the cat was in some sort of superposition before you open the box, right? Um, how does it go from being in a superposition to being either in a clear state of being alive or dead, right? That's the classic paradox of Erwin Schrodinger back in the 1930s. One solution is that when you open the box, the universe splits in two, including not only the cat in the box in the laboratory and all the people inside the laboratory, but the entire universe, the whole observable cosmos. It's a very profligate idea, to use the term of the great Peter Atkins. So that one, copy of the universe, say the original copy, the cat's dead, and then or alive, let's say dead, and then there's a copy of the universe that splits off. So if I measure the cat to be dead, there's a copy universe and a copy version of myself that measures the cat to be alive, right? Now that's one solution, and some people on YouTube take this as fact and things like that. Um, and where it's really just kind of one interpretation. Um, and I think it comes from Hugh Everett, or at least some people who um, read Hugh Everett's work in the late 50s. Um, Now, that's not the only possible solution. There are what's called hidden variable theories to basically say that uh, the cat is truly alive or truly dead, but there's hidden variables. There's things that are not given by the Schrodinger wave equation, the unitary evolution of a quantum state, whether it's a particle or a cat. There's sort of other things going on that inform upon, whether the cat's alive or dead. But these hidden variables, point number one, there's never been evidence for it. Sort of, for example, Louis de Broglie's pilot wave theory. It was a noble effort, but there's just not a lot of evidence with that. Um, and second of all, and I'm a little fuzzy on the details here, but from what I've read, they don't do well with preserving locality. So if you introduce hidden variables, you essentially introduce non-locality, or the possibility. What I mean by that, the possibility to send signals faster than the speed of light, which is disallowed, of course, by special relativity. So hidden variables have a problem of no direct evidence and allowing for non-locality. Um, Another possible solution to this is that there's spontaneous collapse of the wave function once you get a certain level of macroscopic size. That once this system stops being a particle or a handful of particles and is something as big as a cat, that something magical happens and the wave function collapses. And a lot of time and money since the 1960s has been spent trying to find the threshold. What threshold of size happens where the wave function spontaneously dissipates? And, luminaries such as Roger Penrose have advocated this idea, but again, there's just no evidence. So hidden variables ideas, spontaneous collapse ideas have failed to solve this problem. So indeed, the simplest Occam's razor solution to this is that the wave function never collapses. But then if we say that, then the question is, why do we see live cats or dead cats or particles spin up or spin down, but not, half alive and half dead cats and half spin up and half spin down, right? Why do we see a classical world, a classical non-quantum world? I will make a slight diversion to The Great Gatsby. In the story, The Great Gatsby, Jay Gatsby was a newly rich person on the Gold Coast, South Coast of Long Island, the wealthy section of Long Island, and his fellow rich people couldn't understand who this guy was. He came out of nowhere with a lot of money, and they made up a lot of backstories, like, oh, he's the nephew to the Kaiser, all these highfalutin, complicated backstories. But his Jay Gatsby's romantic rival, sort of his antagonist, Tom Buchanan, played wonderfully by Bruce Dern in the 1975 version of The Great Gatsby. He said that his impression of Jay Gatsby was that he was a big bootlegger. He said a lot of these newly rich folks are just big bootleggers, right? Meaning there's nothing super complicated, nothing mysterious. There's no connection with the German Kaiser. Jay Gatsby was simply one of many newly rich people who were working class people who hit it big on bootlegging, and now they got money from bootlegging. And there wasn't anything deeper about Jay Gatsby than that. He was, basically the 1920s version of a drug smuggler. So that's a kind of a funny story, but I bring that up to say that it's kind of a version of Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation tends to be the right one. That sometimes we try to get things complicated because we want the interesting explanation, but really the simpler explanations tend to be better. And in the case of the quantum measurement problem, the simplest explanation is that it's true that the wave function never collapses. But the reason why we see a classical world is very simply that we don't see the entirety of the wave function. Now, Stephen Hawking, in a discussion with Roger Penrose in 1994, there was a series of lectures and debate published under the book The Nature of Space and Time, suggested this himself in sort of a throwaway remark. It was sort of peripheral to his main topics of discussion, but he talked about, because the cosmic event horizon in a typical sort of expanding space-time, or typical Annie de Sitter metric, the negatively curved metric solution of general relativity that's expanding from the Big Bang, going faster and faster and faster in terms of the expansion rate as you go forward in time, it expands faster than light from the furthest reaches of the universe can get to you. So the event horizon, i.e. the cosmic event horizon, the event horizon of the universe that we can see, never covers the whole universe. There's always parts of the universe coming out of that initial singularity, the Annie de Sitter space-time model, that we can't necessarily see, right? So because the cosmic event horizon never covers the entirety of the universe, there's always these parts of the universe we can't see. And in a certain sense, the cosmic event horizon is sort of like the box of the Schrodinger's cat experiment. We can imagine that we, as the observers, we as people on planet Earth, we're the cat, we're inside the box, and that the walls of the box are, in fact, the cosmic event horizon. And everything outside the box, outside the cosmic event horizon, is like the laboratory. It's the environmental decoherence, right? So the cat's alive or dead because of the environmental decoherence of the laboratory. We, on planet Earth, see classical world because we can't see the entirety of the cosmos. We're limited by that classical wave function. The world looks classical because we're limited by the cosmic event horizon. We can't see the whole universe. And to put this another way, we are limited to, seeing parts of the wave function, right? We can never see the entirety of the wave function. And there's something called the Bayesian interpretation of quantum mechanics, which I guess is what I'm saying is a little bit close to that, although maybe not precisely that. But the Bayesian interpretation is basically observers all sort of have their own copy of the wave function, and because of that, they can disagree on certain aspects, but they'll all agree on causality. And that might be one way of looking at it. But I'm not trying to get too deep in the weeds in terms of the Bayesian interpretation. I've only read a little bit about that, to be fair. But even leaving that aside, even if we say, we can all agree on one wave function or whatever, that wave function is still limited. We can't see the entire cosmos. And I think there's a deeper point to be made, that part of what it is to be a conscious being is to be epistemically limited. I'm reminded of that, the Old Man on the Mountain, the profile in New Hampshire, right? It's torn away by erosion now, but it used to be a pile of rocks on a mountain that from one point of view, you see a profile. But the point is that profile only emerged into existence from, a certain angle of looking at it. So part of the being, the ontological being of that man on the mountain was that limitation, was the fact that you can only see it from a certain angle. You see it from a different angle, the illusion disappeared. So our experience as conscious beings in the universe is predicated upon epistemic limitation. And were we able to see the entirety of the wave function, the universe would cease to be classical, but I would also say we would cease to be existing. That part of consciousness, I strongly think, has to do with epistemic limitation. So you could say that the cat and the world is classical, not because there's a spontaneous collapse of the wave function, not because there's hidden variables, but because simply we only ever have some part of that wave function that we have access to. And there might be some deeper thing of people having their own kind of private, if you will, wave functions from an epistemic point of view, similar like in relativity, everybody has their own clock and so forth and so on. That gets a little bit beyond the scope here. But you don't really need to get into that level, I don't think. Another way to look at this is the cosmic background radiation is temperature 3 degrees Kelvin, something like that. I don't have it in front of me. But that number is sort of an amalgamation, most likely, of all the different ways the universe could have begun. And I'm not going to get into cosmogenesis theories here or whatever. That gets way beyond the scope here. But let's just say there were certain initial conditions for at least our part of the universe in an anti-de Sitter model that led to the temperature of the cosmic background radiation we see. But my point is, the temperature we see is not sort of one quantum possibility or the other. It's an amalgamation. It's an averaging out of all the possibilities, right? So we never see sort of one branch of the quantum decision tree or another. We see all branches of the quantum decision tree at the same time, but an average thereof. And that average thereof gives us, 3 degrees Kelvin on the cosmic background, gives us cats that are alive or dead and so forth, right? The classical world, we see the average. So instead of seeing the best of all possible worlds, as some literary character or another talked about, we see simply the average of all possible worlds, right? And this is something that Hawking talked about more than once, although he didn't really dwell on it much, and therefore people misquote and misunderstand Hawking all the time. Hawking never was one of those, the universe branches every time you make a quantum measurement. He always saw, our universe as being sort of an amalgamation of all possible universes, or, at least in many parts of his writings. So we see this averaging out. And why do we see the averaging out? Because we only see this part of the wave function. And obviously, we don't have a final theory of consciousness. Maybe we'll never have a final theory of consciousness for Gödelian reasons, and that's a separate issue. But I think, again, I strongly think that a hypothetical being that could see the whole universe would not be conscious, or could see the whole wave function of the universe, to be more precise. That by seeing part of the wave function, by being limited by, like I was talking about, that cosmic event horizon, the universe gives us classicality, or appears classical. And this is a speculation, but classicality is a requirement for consciousness, right? The banana tree has to be in location A, not halfway in location B, and not and halfway in location C or whatever, right? We need to know where the banana tree is. We need to know where the food is. We need to know where the predators are. Things need to be in one place or the other, not partly here and partly there, right? The universe has to have a distinct a sense of discreteness to it. The food's over here, the predator's over here, so get away from the predators over here and go to the food over there. So clearly, to evolve and to survive in evolution, the universe needs to appear to us to be classical. And I think a conscious being that sees the universe as not being classical is not a conscious being. I think that's an oxymoron. So the wave function does not collapse, and you don't need hidden variables, and you don't need again some sort of spontaneous collapse, and you certainly don't need a profligate notion of the universe branching out. The truth is much more simple. Jay Gatsby is simply a bootlegger. It's simply that we don't have access to the entire wave function. We don't see the entirety of the cosmic wave function. We don't see the entirety of the cat's wave function. We don't see the entirety of any wave function, because every wave function, even that of an electron, can spread over all of space-time by definition, right? And so because of this epistemic limitation, the universe is classical. I'll sort of end this on a Dan Dennett joke. The philosophy student goes to his philosophy professor and says, "Hey, professor, I went to see a magic show last night, and the magician sawed the woman in half. How did the magician do that? And the professor says to the student, well, you see, student, it's not that he really saw the woman in half. It only seemed like the woman was sawed in half. And the student says, well, professor, how did the magician do that? The professor said, oh, well, that's not my department. I'm a philosophy professor. It's not my department. How the magician did it, not my department. Right? So, the universe seems classical. It's not really classical, but it seems classical to us because we only see part of the universe. Now, as for the sort of the machinations of consciousness and all that, that's not really my department, right? But Jay Gatsby's just a bootlegger. There's nothing deeper there. The magician doesn't really saw the lady in half. It just seems like he saw the lady in half. The universe seems classical to us, and it's not really classical, and we see an averaging out of the quantum possibilities, not one part of the decision tree another. Again, we see the whole decision tree as sort of an averaging out, sort of the Feynman sum over histories. And we do that because we only have access to that part of the wave function. So I'm putting this out there to dispense with the profligate notion of this sort of branching out idea of a quantum multiverse, which is quite frankly all over YouTube. So thank you and have a nice day.